I think we find ourselves in pretty unusual times over here in Thailand and here in Mae Sot and here in my life. So an update video seems like a pretty good idea. It's unusual partially because we're at the end of the Songkran holidays here in Thailand, and Songkran is the biggest holiday of the year here. It's kind of a New Year holiday, and normally it's a giant water festival. You've probably seen videos of this on TV or on YouTube in the past, where foreigners will go to places like Bangkok or Chiang Mai, and you can't step out onto the street without 100 buckets of water hitting you from all directions. It's a giant celebration. But of course, with the pandemic, all of that was canceled. There basically are no water celebrations at all, except for going back to the very original meaning behind the water, which I believe was part of a tradition, a Buddhist tradition of sprinkling water onto the statue of the Buddha. And water, of course, is always a purification symbol, an end to the year, the beginning of a new year, and that kind of thing. And of course, here in Southeast Asia, this idea of sprinkling water grew and grew until it became a countrywide water fight, basically. It's a giant party over all of Thailand. I've never been here for that festival in Thailand, but a couple of years ago I was in Myanmar for their version of this festival called, I always get the name wrong, the pronunciation wrong, Thingan. And it really was a surprise. The excitement and the energy levels and the scale of the water festival that I was in the middle of in Yangon was a huge surprise. But here, this year, pretty much nothing. There has been no water fighting aspect to the holidays at all that I'm aware of. Another big part of that festival, as with many festivals in Asia, is that it is a time for people to go home, to leave the big city and return to their hometowns, their home villages, and visit with their family, to pay respect to their parents and to their grandparents. So Songkran is normally one of those huge migrations that you hear about in Asia. I think for example, the Chinese New Year holiday, in China, in normal years, so many people return home from the big cities that it has become the largest human migration in all of history. So many people are on the move and heading home. And here in Thailand during Songkran, that normally is what also takes place. And to a certain extent that did take place here this year, but of course, because of the pandemic and travel restrictions, it was quite muted compared to a normal year. But this ties in with the other topic on my mind about why this is such an unusual time, because in Bangkok there were a lot of restrictions lifted recently, and bars and entertainment venues were allowed to open again. That was true for a number of weeks. I'm not sure exactly how long. And then that led to an increase in the COVID infection rates in Bangkok. And this panicked the authorities, of course, and they started to worry about Songkran, because if you had this surge in Bangkok, and then at Songkran, everyone from Bangkok goes home, then now perhaps you're looking at what, of course, they call these days, super spreader events, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of concern in the provinces, and in recent days, all kinds of new travel restrictions have gone into place. Tak province, where I am here, is now designated a red zone. I think nearly all the provinces in the north and surrounding Bangkok are now designated as red zones. which means everything is closed again. Schools are closed, restaurants are closed in some ways, entertainment venues are all closed. Just a lot of closures, and there's a lot of border restrictions between provinces. So I don't know all the details, they're impossible for me to find out. But basically, there is a chance that if you leave Tak province and try to go to another province like Chiang Mai, you will either be turned back at the border or you will be told to do a 14-day quarantine just to go from one province into the other province. So yeah, it's weird that Songkran, the time of the year when we have the most people traveling from province to province, we now have this level of travel restrictions that make that very difficult. But even so, I think millions of people did leave Bangkok and go home. So everyone is kind of holding their breath and waiting to see what the result of this is going to be. So that's kind of what's going on here in Mae Sot. I've been in this part of the world for quite a few of these big holidays, and they always strike me as kind of unusual because of what happens to the cities. I remember being in Korea many times during Chuseok, and Chuseok is kind of their version of Thanksgiving. And again, part of the tradition is for everyone to go home. So I was living in Seoul at the time, which is at the northern tip of Korea, and there'd be another big city way down at the southern end of Korea. And at Chuseok, so many people would leave Seoul that the highway going all the way from the north of the country to the south would be a total traffic jam. Like the entire highway stretching 300 or 400 or 500 kilometers, whatever it is, from beginning to end would just be one long line of bumper to bumper cars all the way down. It's just crazy to see. And I saw those news stories year after year, and I always wondered, why do it? I mean, if I saw that, I wouldn't try to go home. Some of these people would leave Seoul to go home. It would take so long just to drive back to their home that by the time they got there, it was pretty much time to turn around and drive back again to go back to work. So yeah, I would just stay where I was. But yeah, family duty calls, and everyone has to go home during this time. And then I was in Taipei for Chinese New Year. And the crazy thing about Chinese New Year is that Taipei, from a foreigner's point of view, turns into a ghost town. Everybody leaves the city to go home, and all the businesses closed. Like nothing is open. So if you're an English teacher in Taipei during Chinese New Year and you stay in Taipei, you have trouble feeding yourself because everything is closed. Stores are closed, restaurants are closed. My beloved coffee shops all closed. The city just turns into a ghost town. And this kind of happens with other cities all across the country. And Mae Sot has been no different this week. This week of Songkran, as I walk around the streets here, I felt like I was the only one in the whole city. I never saw anybody. There's almost no traffic, no people, and all the businesses are closed. Today, things are starting to open up a little bit, and I'm on one of the busier streets in Mae Sot here, so you see that there is some traffic around me, and then the businesses are starting to open up again. But for the longest time, I felt like I was the only person in this city. It's really a strange feeling. To be honest, the only reasonable thing for a foreigner to do during Chinese New Year in Taiwan is to leave the country. And that's what most foreigners do. They plan a holiday for that time, book a flight, and they leave the ghost country of Taiwan and head somewhere else and wait for the holiday to blow over, and then they return to work. But that's kind of a double-edged sword too. You get a chance to go on a holiday, but everyone is going on holiday at the exact same time. So now you've got a situation where there are very few seats available on flights. Hotels are booked out. And if you wait too long to book your flight, you're paying 3-4 times the normal price flight costs just skyrocket during a Chinese New Year. So it's the one time of year when you have some days off and you can go on a holiday, and yet it's the absolute worst time of the year to actually take a holiday. It's a sort of a kind of a catch-22. Speaking of red zones and the pandemic, I read a fascinating article in Scientific American just a couple of days ago about viruses in general, and it introduced a completely new set of ideas and new vocabulary to me. It's really quite interesting. This article was about what they call the human virome, virome, kind of like a biodome, except our human body as a home for viruses. They call it the virome. And I didn't know anything about this, to be honest, like nothing at all. But it turns out that each of our bodies is normally home to 380 trillion individual viruses. 380 trillion. And I'm used to the idea of our body being full of bacteria. You just learn about this over time. We have bacteria living in our digestive system, bacteria living everywhere, all over us. We have little creatures, probably monstrous-looking creatures if you look at them under a microscope, all over our bodies. We're covered in them, you know, inside and out. But I always thought of bacteria for the most part. But it turns out, biologists estimate that each of us has about 38 trillion bacteria in our bodies. You know, friendly bacteria, just living their lives, doing what they do, and they don't cause us any harm unless they kind of get out of control. But it turns out that not only do we have 38 trillion bacteria, our bodies contain 380 trillion viruses. And that is what they call the virodome. I had no idea. And these viruses are similar to the bacteria in that they are supposed to be kind of not harmful. We think of viruses as things that carry disease and kill us, of course, or make us sick. But these viruses, they're always there. They're always in our bodies. And again, assuming they don't get out of control, they don't really cause us much harm either. They're just part of our human ecosystem. And I honestly never knew this. There are lots of fascinating things about this concept of the virodome. One is that each of us kind of has our own distinct virodome. The collection and number of viruses in my body is kind of unique to me compared to you. And when you live in a house, in a home with other people, you end up sharing kind of the same virodome because you're constantly passing viruses to other people through food, through the bathroom, through touching, through the air, and you're exchanging all these viruses all the time. And as you live with a person in the same home, the same apartment, you eventually reach kind of a similar virodome with all these other, or virome, with all the people around you, which is a fascinating idea. And I don't quite know what to make of this idea yet, but in this article, it said that they now estimate that 50% of the biological material in our body is not human. So if you add up all the viruses, all the bacteria, all the fungi, all the other creatures that are living inside us, and compare that to our own human body cells, 50% of what's standing in front of you in this video is not human. Like, half of me is made of my own cells, and the other half is made up of all these other creatures, these hundreds of trillions of creatures. And I don't believe that number. It just doesn't seem right, 50%. But it's what they said in Scientific American. I'll have to do some research to figure out what exactly they mean by that, and whether it's true or not. This article left me with quite a few questions, and one, of course, is about what the viruses are doing, because as far as I understand the natural world, viruses can't replicate on their own. They have to hijack the mechanisms of our cells in order to take over the machinery and replicate themselves inside human cells. And they do this and replicate so much that so many viruses are produced that they end up bursting the boundaries of the cell, which kills the cell. And that sounds like it's hurting me. And yet these scientists are saying that these viruses don't actually cause any harm. But how can that be true when their life cycle involves destroying my cells, you know? So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. And there are some very interesting viruses, an entire class of them called bacteriophages. And a bacteriophage is a virus that lives inside bacteria. So instead of invading a human cell, they look for a specific type of bacteria that they like, and then they enter the body of the bacteria, hijack the bacteria's replicating abilities to produce more copies of the virus, and then the bacteria bursts and dies. So in a way, the viruses are like these predators inside our body, and there are some of them that hunt bacteria, and these bacteria can be harmful to us if there's too many of them. So in fact, the viruses are kind of like our own built-in predators, keeping down the population of these harmful bacteria. So yeah, it's a crazy idea, everything to do with the Virome. I just realized that I kept saying Virodome, but it's not Virodome, it's Virome. They call this the human virome. And I love this idea because it kind of turns me into this planet. You know, my body, me, that I'm out here walking around Mae Sot, I'm actually my own planet, home to hundreds and hundreds of trillions of little creatures all going about their lives, and they live on me just like I'm living on the planet Earth. So I am my own planet, it just seems. And I like to think of these little creatures as monitoring what I'm doing. And let's say I have some really tasty soup for lunch, or I make spaghetti for dinner, and they're all excited, and all these hundreds of trillions of creatures are happy and cheering because I'm eating spaghetti. Because everything I eat feeds me, but it also feeds all these hundreds of trillions of viruses and bacteria and other creatures, right? They depend on me to feed them, and if I don't eat, they don't eat. They need me. So, yeah, it's just sort of a crazy idea. I think we find ourselves in pretty unusual times over here in Thailand, and here in Mae Sot, and here in my life. So an update video seems like a pretty good idea.